In American criminal justice, few things carry more weight than a confession. Jurors trust them. Prosecutors rely on them. Police build entire cases around them. But what happens when a confession isn't the product of truth, but of pressure, confusion, and psychological manipulation? In 2005, a quiet, learning disabled teenager named Brendan Dassey was pulled out of his high school classroom and walked into an interrogation room. He walked out branded a murderer. No physical evidence tied him to the crime. No witnesses saw him commit anything. Yet his own words, shaped, guided, and molded by police, became the foundation of a life sentence. This is the story of how the Reid technique, America's most widely used interrogation method, created one of the most disturbing false confessions in modern history. Brendan Ray Dassey was born on October 19, 1989, in Manitowoc County, Wisconsin. He grew up on the Avery Salvage Yard, a rural, isolated property owned by his extended family. Life there was quiet, poor, and largely cut off from the outside world. Brendan was a shy, introverted child who struggled deeply in school. Teachers described him as slow to process information, easily confused, and eager to please adults, even when he didn't understand what they were asking. School evaluation showed Brendan had an IQ around 70, placing him in the borderline intellectually disabled range. He had severe learning disabilities, poor verbal comprehension, and limited ability to understand abstract concepts like time, consequence, and legal rights. Psychologists later testified that he was highly suggestible, meaning he was especially likely to agree with authority figures, particularly when under stress. Brendan had never been in trouble with the law. He had no violent tendencies. He was known as a gentle, awkward teenager who liked video games and spent most of his time at home. But Brendan was also the nephew of Stephen Avery, a man who had already become a symbol of injustice after spending 18 years wrongfully imprisoned for a rape he did not commit, only to be exonerated by DNA in 2003. By 2005, Avery had a $36 million lawsuit pending against Manitowoc County for that wrongful conviction, putting law enforcement under intense pressure. Brendan lived in the shadow of that controversy, even though he had done nothing wrong. On October 31, 2005, Teresa Halbach, a 25-year-old freelance photographer for Auto Trader, arrived at the Avery Salvage Yard to photograph a vehicle Stephen Avery was selling. She never returned home. Days later, her SUV was found hidden on the property. Over the following weeks, investigators claimed to find bone fragments, electronics, and other evidence pointing to Stephen Avery. Avery was arrested and charged with first-degree intentional homicide. At first, Brendan Dassey was not considered a suspect. Police saw him as a possible witness, a quiet kid who might have seen something. That changed when investigators began interpreting Brendan's confusion as guilt. In November 2005, Brendan was questioned informally. He gave vague, inconsistent answers, not because he was lying, but because he did not understand how to explain events in sequence. Investigators misread this as deception. This was the first catastrophic failure of the Reid technique. They treated cognitive impairment as suspicious behavior. By February 2006, detectives had already decided Brendan was involved. From that moment on, the goal was no longer to discover what happened. It was to make Brendan say what they believed. On February 27th, Brendan was pulled out of school and taken to the sheriff's office. He was 16 years old, no lawyer, no parent, no real understanding of what was happening. Investigators Mark Wiegert and Tom Fassbender placed Brendan alone in a small room and began applying the Reid technique. They told him they already knew what happened. They told him denial was pointless. They told him the truth would set him free. This is classic Reid strategy. Present guilt as fact and make confession feel inevitable. When Brendan denied involvement, they rejected his answers. When he said he didn't know, they insisted he did. When he became confused, they told him he was being dishonest. They also used false evidence ploys, claiming they had proof even when they didn't. And they implied that telling them what they wanted to hear would allow him to go home. For a frightened, cognitively impaired teenager, this created a powerful illusion. Confession equals safety. Brendan did not describe the crime on his own. He guessed, and the detectives corrected him. He got details wrong, and they guided him. When he failed to supply key facts, they subtly gave him hints. The most chilling moment came when Brendan asked, "Who shot her in the head?" That was not something a guilty person would ask. It was something someone who didn't know the story would say. Yet instead of correcting him, investigators replied, "Who do you think did?" Brendan guessed, Stephen Avery. From that point on, detectives fed him the rest of the narrative. Rape, stabbing, shooting, even though no physical evidence supported any of it.
Yeah, but I got a question.
What's that?
What would happen if he says something, like his story is different, but he says he admits to doing it?
What do you mean?
Like, if his story's like different, like, I never did nothing or something.
Did you? Huh?
Not really.
What do you mean, not really?
They got to my head.
Huh?
I didn't say anything.
I have a question for you, Stu. Is there any way that I can talk to him? Not him. The other one.
As in Steve, you mean?
Yes.
The only way we could have you talk to him is if he calls you, or if it's, you go there for visiting.
I won't go there to visit.
Okay. That's the only way. I have no other way of, I can't hook you up to him or anything like that. I'm not allowed to do that. If he calls you, you can do what you want. Or if you go there for visiting, that's up to you.
2 days later, Brendan was brought back in. By now, he believed he must have done something wrong. This second session was used to lock in the story, a common read technique after an initial confession. Despite glaring inconsistencies, police treated the story as fact. Soon after, Brendan Dassey was arrested and charged with murder. At trial, experts testified that Brendan was too cognitively impaired to understand his rights and too suggestible to give a reliable confession. But the jury heard his words, stripped of context, and that was enough. He was convicted. He was sentenced to life. He was 17 years old. Brendan Dassey's interrogation is now taught as a warning: a juvenile, intellectual disability, no lawyer, false evidence, implied promises, confession feeding, zero corroboration. Every safeguard failed. Brendan Dassey didn't confess because he was guilty. He confessed because the read technique made resistance feel impossible. In that room, truth didn't matter. Only compliance did. And a child lost his life to a system that mistook obedience for guilt.